Welcome to the Campaign Trend Podcast, where you're joining in on a conversation with the entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. I'm your host, Eric Wilson. Our guest today is Doug Usher, a partner at Forbes Tate Partners and co-founder of the analytics program at Columbia University. Doug has spent more than 2 decades working at the intersection of opinion research, analytics, and strategy, helping corporations, industry groups, and political campaigns understand how audiences think and how to reach them. In this episode, we discussed a shift in how political influence is being built. For decades, campaigns mostly borrowed audiences from allies and institutions and rented attention through paid media. But a growing number of candidates are trying something different, building their own audiences directly through social platforms and maintaining that connection well beyond Election Day. So, Doug, we're going to link to this piece, but you make the argument that we're seeing a shift from the traditional model of borrowing and renting audiences towards candidates building their own audiences. Set that framework up for us. What does build versus borrow actually mean in practical campaign terms?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on, Eric. I think the way we should think about it is think about what a campaign has to do. It has to get to, in a general election, 50% plus one. In a primary election, some number, sometimes as low as 21%, sometimes as high as 50%, to win. And the question is, how do you find, identify, and get enough people to get you over that hurdle? Additionally, you try to borrow those audiences. What do I mean by that? You need to go to people that have those folks and get them to endorse you. You need to get in front of audiences that exist. And in the past, and still today to some extent, you had to go to the places where those folks already were. And so you think about what a typical campaign does. It gets endorsements from, say, unions or business groups, with the idea that their 10,000 or 20,000 or 100,000 or 10 million followers will then join you. You get on TV to get the audiences that watch that program. You buy ads on TV to get those people that are watching news or watching a specific sitcom or something like that to identify, to help them support you. The problem with that is that just creates a very weak connection. So instead, a lot of candidates are doing what, they're almost acting like social media stars. They're starting from scratch. They're grabbing individual people through social content, through connections, through linking with other folks. And when it's done right, you create this robust audience that is built around you, as opposed to grabbing the union person, grabbing the business person, grabbing the media endorsement.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that it was enabled by technology that we could make that shift, because previously, if you wanted to publish news, you needed to have a printing press and reporters and distribution and paper boys. And if you wanted to broadcast video, you needed to have an FCC license. You need to have access to a cable program. If you wanted to have your audio heard, you needed to have that access to a radio antenna. And that's really gone away. And I think back to a line that Marco Rubio said when I was working on his presidential primary. We have Uber, which is the biggest transportation company that doesn't own a single car. Airbnb, the biggest hospitality company, doesn't own a single building. And this idea of capitalism without capital. And so we're starting to see that come into campaigns. And so one thing that struck me in your piece is that building an audience isn't just about winning elections. It changes how the power dynamic works once you're in office. So how does owning an audience change how elected officials operate once they're in government?
Yeah, it's a great way to think about it, because when you're borrowing audiences, you are creating an exchange. And everyone who's been around Washington, everyone who's worked on a campaign knows that if you're going to get the labor endorsement, well, you are trading something, maybe
They're
a
going to come
position or
calling.
maybe
Yeah.
exactly. And they're going to call back for a favor. When you run an ad on TV, that creates this very limited window where you're trying to get someone to remember you when they go into When you build an audience, just so we can be very specific here, Bernie Sanders has built a durable audience. It is a one-to-one connection or one-to-many connection where people identify with Bernie. What does that mean? That means when he does something after the election, he then can draw his own audiences to Bernie. He becomes an institution himself. That becomes durable because people know if Bernie endorses me, I'm going to be able to raise more money. Or if Bernie endorses my issue, there might be a bunch of calls flooding the Capitol Hill phone line in a way that a more traditional politician wouldn't have. And the other examples are AOC, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and of course, the biggest one of all, Donald Trump, building their own audience, which then conveys not just during the election and not after election day, but all the way from there moving forward.
Yeah, and mentioning Trump, I mean, there's a good example here of, previously presidents. Yes, they were top of the pile, but they were still kind of beholden to that party structure, and we see in a way that Trump has not followed that way and has really remade the party in sort of his likeness. And I think another thing that jumps out at me is it's really made Congress almost ungovernable. So if you think about, speakers past who had maybe appropriations or committee assignments to whip someone in line who wasn't going the right way, it doesn't matter if you're on a committee anymore. You can raise more money if you've got your own audience. And so I think it really has affected how Congress works in a way that leadership hasn't figured out a way to navigate. And there might not be a way other than you just have to have a bigger audience.
Right. And it's how you organize a legislature has traditionally been through party structure. So, there was party discipline. Why was there party discipline? Because the head of the party could then discipline you. But the head of the Republican Party, whoever that is anymore, I guess it's Donald Trump, but or the head of the Democratic Party, we certainly don't know who that is, can't turn around and say, hey, AOC, you better vote this way or I'm going to cut off your funding for the next election. And so you're right that so when you take each of these almost individual brands and put them into Congress, how you can organize them is incredibly hard. Now, Donald Trump has done an amazing job by basically staying in control of the caucus. But that's one person, and I think that's an exceptional example that we probably won't soon repeat. But you're right, making things ungovernable is almost the eventual outcome when these traditional institutions like the press, like parties, like unions, like others, don't have the same control over their constituents.
Yeah, I would love to, bring LBJ back or Tip O'Neill and see what they would do, because all of the tools that made them such effective leaders of the Senate and House just aren't there. So I don't know if they could figure it out. Doug, I think most people instinctively do want to own their audience rather than rent it, right? I mean, it just sounds better. But campaigns have this really brutal time constraint, and that, you might have 12 to 18 months from start to finish. And so in that situation, when is borrowing or renting still the right strategy?
Mm-hmm. I think, to be honest, if I were running for office or one were running for office, it's not a great strategy. Meaning, if you are trying to get to office in the easiest way possible, it's still very hard. And as you know from your campaign time, most politicians want to win and they'll take whatever look, I'm not saying they're bad people, they're good people. They want to win their job.
Path of least resistance. Yeah.
Exactly. And this is not a path of least resistance. What I will say, though, is what we should expect to happen. And just to be clear, this is a handful. A dozen members of Congress, could you say, are even beginning to move in this direction, right? Out of the tens of thousands of people that are elected, I wouldn't even be able to tell you how many have this type of approach. But I would say that if you were trying to find a new candidate, normally we had said, are they rich?
Mm-hmm.
Have they been elected to office a lot? Or
Are
are
they
they
a
a
lawyer?
local? Are they right? Exactly. And those were important because they would then have money or they would have experience. Now I would actually say, what is your social media following? Do you already have a brand that you could expand? Because that's really a new talent and skill that goes beyond the typical, dialing for dollars or beyond the typical legislative experience that you could do that voters will react to just like they do with everything else.
Yeah. And that brings up a really important consideration here. And I confront this all the time when sharing digital strategies or best practices. And I'll call this challenge, sort of style or niche. Someone like a Marjorie Taylor Greene or an AOC can occupy that lane and build their audience, right? Because they're kind of on the spectrums, the different ends of the spectrums of their party. I'm curious if you have thoughts about how does an individual member of Congress who may find themselves right in the middle of their caucus stand out and build their audience?
That I think is really where the challenge is going to lie. And I haven't written this piece yet, but it's one I want to write with the idea that moderate candidates and moderate politicians require strong institutions. Why? Because moderate candidates do not bring out the types of passion that self-audience building requires, right? Moderate candidates need labor unions to say, you can trust this person, you can trust her, they're great. And they say, well, I'm not sure. They seem to be sort of, either or. I say, no, this is the person for you. But as you know, the things that work online, the things that raise money online, the things that sell products online, and frankly, the things that get people to follow politicians online, it's either extreme or extremely compelling. And, you can use Mamdani as an example, depending on your point of view. It's either, oh, he's really inflamed extreme folks. That's how he was able to get it. Or actually, no, he's had these amazingly compelling pieces of content about government that no one would have ever expected that has brought people on. It's not his views on Israel that might have brought some folks in there, but it's really that the guy is interested and energetic, but he gets to show that. And so that's for the moderate person, the person in the center of the caucus. This is not, I don't think this trend is helpful for them.
Yeah. One thing that I sort of wonder about is if there's a way to carve out a niche. Say you're a more moderate member, but you really dedicate yourself to being a behind the scenes institutionalist kind of person, and going that way. I like to think about this in terms of templates of what are the different types of creators that are out there, and how can you mimic content in that niche. And so I'm thinking about watching old This Old House episodes on YouTube. I find those really helpful, how to deal with things around my house. It'd be really interesting if we had someone, doing that on Capitol Hill. So I think there's a path there. The easiest one, of course, is go say something extreme on either end of the spectrum.
And the other way to think about it is, so we've talked about folks who are building their audience around politics. Right. Every one of these people, MTG, even though she wasn't in office when she first started, Zoran Mamdani, they built their audience building on sort of politics, whether it's sort of commenting on the issues of the day with MTG or getting outraged at Washington, or with Mamdani, it was building a campaign. There could be other ways to build an audience, or people that have pre-built their audience that come to it and have moderate positions, but that personality that's built that audience. I mean, it could be, a fix-it guy. It could be somebody who everyone's favorite plumber on YouTube could say, look, I'm running for office. I've been fixing plumbing for 20 years and I've got 3 million followers. Guess what? It's time to fix the plumbing in Washington.
Right.
I'm not suggesting that as a slogan, but that person might be able to build on that sort of moderate can-do-it personality and translate to politics, as opposed to using the extreme of politics to build their audience.
You're listening to the Campaign Trend Podcast. I'm speaking with Doug Usher, a partner at Forbes Tate, about the phenomenon of building versus borrowing your audience. Doug, one thing that I've always found interesting in public affairs is how eager organizations are to sponsor someone else's platform. So whether that's a newsletter, podcast, events, instead of building their own audiences, because they're around permanently in a way that campaigns aren't necessarily constrained. Why do you think institutions I'm thinking trade associations, corporate government affairs, why are they still so reluctant to build instead of borrow?
I wonder if it's reluctance or sort of traditionalness, or the idea that it's really, really, really hard. And the point that attaches to that is, to use an old George H.W. Bush line, let a thousand, a thousand points of light. And once you're established as pharma, once you're established as NAM, you can't just do a thousand things. You've already built that reputation. The other reason, and this is I think also a flip side of the same thing, is these new institutions, the Axioses, the Punch Bowls, etc. They've built an audience that is novel as well. They saw the opportunity. They reworked the news business and said, actually, what we want to do is find the audience that will then be attractive to advertisers. So I think it's a combination of, as you mentioned earlier, the path of least resistance, that I can actually put myself, by paying 50,000 or 100,000 of these folks in this room. But the idea that these institutions could then create a following to them is so challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, look, any one of these institutions, to start to do some effort on social media that's a little bit out there, requires the people from every one of their members, or every one of their members, to agree, and that's almost impossible.
Yeah, I think it's probably a case of the structure is just kind of ossified, and what you see in a lot of these things is, we want to buy the sponsorship or host this event so our opponents don't get the opportunity to. It's sort of like it's protecting your turf.
I mean, it's like saying, anyone who's worked in public affairs or worked in a shop like mine, a client comes to you and says, "Make me a viral video." You say, "Well, you're looking at the wrong end of the telescope. It takes 2 million videos before one goes viral, and they're choosing from a sea of content. You know, Everyone sets out to make a viral video, but there's no ingredients to it. That's why they call it viral." And so the same thing, I think, is true for campaigns, right? They say, "I want you to run Mamdani's campaign. I want, all of Mamdani's consultants are now getting flown around the world to
Right.
run the next campaign." And what they're going to find is, well, it's kind of hard to do because you're not Mamdani, right?
And so I think one thing that we need to talk about is that traditional campaigns build coalitions. So whether you're running for office or trying to get something passed in Washington, and so this new build strategy seems more like you're building an algorithmic following. And so I'm wondering, are those the same thing, or are they fundamentally different political structures, coalition versus algorithm?
The short answer is yes, for sure they're different. And when you say coalition, if you think about it from first of all, when you think about politics or legislation, it's literally all about the votes, right? We've got to remember what the goal is, and whether it's 50% plus one in a general election, whether it's 218 or however many members have shown up that day, or 60 votes to get something through filibuster in the Senate. You need to have combinations of people, and people deliver blocks of votes, right? And who does it take to get those blocks of votes together? I think the idea when it comes to legislating is it's a notion that people work together over time. And so you build these trust relationships that, they talk about the Freedom Caucus, or you talk about the Problem Solvers Caucus. Or you talk about a committee. These are people that have worked together, and people get a sense of what they're going to do. Everything you do that breaks that apart makes the day when it comes to getting people together really hard when it comes to legislating. With that said, it makes it really easy for them to come together on election day. And just one more point that I think is important, taking a step back to the campaign side. Once you've built your audience, they're hunkering for your content.
Mm-hmm.
And think about that versus buying an ad. When you're buying an ad, you are forcing your content into someone's eyeballs. When you're Mamdani and you release a new video about snow shoveling, your folks are like, "This is really cool," and they share it. It's a revolution. I almost I have trouble. You almost have to completely reprogram your idea about how politics works with the idea that, oh my God, people are going to seek me out for my content. It's like the goose that laid the golden egg. That's why it's so hard. It's why it's so rare, but it's why people with diverse backgrounds, like whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene or Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump or Zoran Mamdani, you take those four people and maybe
Very
Donald
little in
Trump, you
common.
imagine it.
Yeah.
But the fact that those four different folks have done it, it just shows you there's no method to doing it.
Yeah. And so as we look ahead to 26 and 28, do you think we're at the beginning of a shift where every candidate is expected to build an audience? For example, if you're recruiting for DCCC or NRCC, you're going out and saying, how many YouTube followers do you have? What's your following on Instagram versus, hey, would you be willing to self-fund? Or will this remain something that only a few candidates can pull off?
I think it will for this foreseeable future be hard for someone to start from scratch and do. So I will give two really good examples of people that are almost trying to shift from traditional track one to social track two. And those are Gavin Newsom and Ted Cruz, two very, strong potential candidates in 2028. Each of them, through their podcasts and social media following, are building their own audience. Ted Cruz has, I think, the most popular politics podcast going on right now. It's certainly the most popular elected official with a
Right.
podcast. That's millions of folks that are going to listen to Ted Cruz on purpose, which, look, Republican or Democrat, few people like to listen to Ted Cruz on purpose. Gavin Newsom is now a darling from, the guy who aided French Laundry during the COVID pandemic, will still be referred to as that, is now a darling. It gets under the president's skin, does all kinds of things. Those are two folks that are using this to build it. And for a presidential primary, that's where it's going to make a big difference. If you can get that audience to activate in Iowa, if you can get that audience to activate in South Carolina, you have a huge leg up.
Yeah. And I think there's I think about this in terms of sort of historical shifts in politics. You think about FDR and his fireside chats over radio, the Kennedy-Nixon debate in 1960 on TV, the rise of cable news, and we're now going through this new transition, and it's really tough on the politicians who came up in the old way and so we're kind of in this in between. And so, Doug, if you were advising maybe a first-time candidate right now, maybe someone running for Congress, what's the first step they should take to start building instead of borrowing? I think we still have to have a combination of both, but what are the steps that they need to take?
So one thing is so if you're advising, I'll go in a slightly different direction. If you're trying to pick a candidate to work for or pick a candidate, you actually want to see somebody who has a track record of building a social media following, because there's no better indication of someone who can't build a social media following than someone who doesn't have one. So the idea, like, build this now, they've done their whole career doing it really well, or doing their career well. But if we're here in the year 2026 and they have 28 followers, not that I have more than that, but the point is they're probably not going to do it. But if you have somebody, the idea is to find out what they've been doing and help supercharge that and work across their different, all their different verticals of work to see what they can do about building that up. Because, by the way, that becomes the fundraising engine. That becomes the vote getting engine. It's not to say that all candidates are going to be like that, but it sure is an important angle, especially for young folks who are thinking of getting into politics.
All right. Well, great advice, and we'll leave it there. My thanks to Doug Usher for a great conversation. Really worth reading his posts. I'll link that in the show notes, and looking forward to more posts coming soon. If this episode made you a little bit smarter, all that we ask you to do is to share it with a friend or colleague. You look smart in the process. They learn something new. More people learn about the show. It's a win-win-win all around. Remember to subscribe to the Campaign Trend podcast wherever you get your episodes, and visit our website, campaigntrend.com. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.